Well, good morning. Good morning. We are, regardless of what that says, we're still in Acts 25. I thought maybe we'd get to Acts 26, and I didn't have a PowerPoint for Acts 25, so I had Tim put that up. But we are actually in earnest going to begin at question 10, but I had some more information I got on Agrippa for question 9, and so I'll be sharing that with you at the beginning of our study this morning. Thank you all for being here. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you so much for the good day you've given us, for the good night's rest, the blessing of safe arrival of each one. We're thankful for those who are live streaming the class. We pray your blessings on all of us as we open your word and study together. We pray that you'll encourage us and guide us and lead us, Father. We thank you so much for Jesus and his sacrifice, and for his resurrection and his ascension into heaven and becoming our King. We thank you for all of the blessings that we receive in him, and it's through him that we pray. Amen. So, we talked about who Agrippa was last week, and that is Herod Agrippa II, that he is the grandson of Herod the Great, and that it was Herod Antipas who had John the Baptist beheaded. That was an uncle of his. And then that Herod Agrippa I was the one who tried to kill, or didn't try, he did kill James and was wanting to kill Peter. And he's the one who God struck with worms and died. Just a little bit more information about him. Because Rome viewed Agrippa as being an authority in Jewish affairs, Jewish scriptures, Jewish conflicts, that he had his finger kind of on the pulse of the nation. Rome also appointed Herod Agrippa II as curator of the temple. And what that means was he had authority to appoint high priests, and he also was given charge of the temple treasury. So he wielded a great deal of power during this particular period of time. And he's going to be king through the time of the destruction of the temple. He and Bernice are going to flee the country, or at least not be stepping back from that. But he's a very powerful person right now, which is why we're going to see Festus kind of yielding to him and happy to talk to him. So question 10, how does Festus lay out Paul's case before Agrippa? Go ahead, John.
Basically says that Paul was being accused by the Jews, and when the Jews made their case, it had more to do with religion, and he said he didn't know how to deal with it, so he wanted Paul to go to Jerusalem.
Okay. So verse 13 tells us that Agrippa and Bernice came to, at least in my translation, to pay their respects to Festus. So Festus is the new procurator. Felix is out. So this is kind of a formal welcome that Agrippa is giving to the new Roman governor. His home, Agrippa's home, is in Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi, I don't think I have, is there a map on here? There we go, thank you. I did need it. So you can see where Caesarea is on the left on the coast. That's Caesarea Maritima. That's where they are right now. And that's where Cornelius was, and all of that. Further north is Caesarea Philippi, and that's the home of Agrippa. That's where his palace is. So he's come down to the other Caesarea, and I don't know, Mike, where we're starting. I think it's up there. I think we're starting at Caesarea Philippi, which was where Peter said, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And all of that happened in Matthew 16 is up there. And so, as John said, Festus tells Felix that Felix left Paul a prisoner The Jews had informed him against Paul when he was there. He got to Caesarea. Remember, 3 days later, he went down to Jerusalem. And they wanted him to release or send Paul down to face them. And Festus said, well, it's not our custom to send people to you, Romans to you. But I'm going back to Caesarea, and you can charge him there. Verse 17 tells us that when they came here with me, so the Jews apparently accompanied Festus back to Caesarea Maritima, and the next day Festus is going to convene a court when he returned to Caesarea. And again, this just underscores to me Festus's attempt to do what's right, and at the same time kind of try to placate the Jews. But the charges, and we talked about this last week, the charges they brought weren't what he thought. That's what he's telling Agrippa. They're not charges against the state. They're rather charges that have to do with their own laws. And the word there is crimes. Let me look here. They did not charge him with any of the crimes I expected. The Greek word there is poneros. It means wickedness. It means evil. It means maliciousness. Festus was expecting to hear about some dastardly actions that Paul had engaged in, and instead there are disputes about their own religion. And the religious word here for religion, I'll try to pronounce it. It's daisi dahiman iha. I know it sounds more like a donkey braying, but it is religion. It means fear or reverence for deity. And in particular, Agrippa is told by Festus it was about a dead man named Jesus. And the verb tense for dead literally means having died and thus being dead. I mean, so it's you're dead and you continue to be dead. So it's a point action that continues. So listen, I'll tell you what's interesting to me about that. I hadn't noticed this before. Even the Jews admit that he was dead. All of the things that you hear about, well, Jesus just fainted. No, the Jews even admit that Jesus actually had died. But Festus says Paul claimed that this Jesus was alive. So what's the part of the dispute about their laws that Festus is hearing? What's the topic of their own religious discussions? Resurrection. That's the resurrection. And you really can't call it a crime because the vast majority of Jews believed in resurrection. The Pharisees believed in it. It's just the Sadducees that didn't. And so the Sadducees didn't charge them with the crime of teaching the resurrection because they would have to charge most of their people with that. But again, I doubt the Sadducees brought that forward as an argument. They certainly didn't with Felix, and Paul is the one who does it here himself, and I assume that he did it with Festus. And I'm sure that he had more to say than just what we read in verse 8, where it says, I've done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews, against the temple, or against Caesar. I'm sure that he went on and elaborated on that more than what Luke tells us. The interesting thing to me is, I think this is probably the first time that Festus has ever heard about resurrection. And what did Paul say the resurrection was to Gentiles? Foolishness. And you can almost hear, as you're reading this, the exasperation in Festus' tone. One Jesus dead, Paul saying he was alive, terrible agitation among the Jews, grievous consequences of which it created. I mean, it's just like, what do you do with these people? How can you handle this? Which, as John pointed out, he confesses he felt out of his depth on this. This isn't what I was ready for. And really, he has no business judging matters like this. That's not why he's been sent there. But I need us to again appreciate the fact his loss is not because he doesn't know what the right thing to do is. What should he have done? He should have said, Paul is guiltless and set him free. Go back, as I was studying this week, I remembered in Acts 18. This is in Corinth, when the Jews are bringing Paul on charges there. And talk about all the bad things that he did. Verse 12, they made a united attack on Paul and brought him into court. This man is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. And just as Paul was about to speak in verse 14, Gallio said to the Jews, if you Jews are making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, that's what we're talking about here. Festus doesn't have that. He hasn't heard anything like that. It would be reasonable for me to listen to you, but since it involves questions about words and names in your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things. So he ejected them from the court. It's exactly what Festus should have done. And then let Paul go, like Gallio did. The difference is Gallio is in Corinth, and Festus is in Judea. And the Jews are a much bigger thorn in this situation than they were there. So that's why he asked Paul and he tells Agrippa that. I asked him if he would be willing to go. Now, to Jerusalem. Now, when he talks to Agrippa here, he doesn't say like he did earlier to Paul, will you go to Jerusalem and appear before me? He doesn't say that to Agrippa here. He confessed ignorance. His confessed ignorance wouldn't have been cured, obviously, by being in Jerusalem. We've already stated that going to Jerusalem doesn't make any sense, at which suggestion Paul appealed to Caesar. And again, he doesn't reveal the reason why Paul appealed to Caesar, because I wouldn't do what I was supposed to do. He forced him to appeal, actually. And so, just that Paul wanted to remain held, or a ward, of the Romans till he could appear and appeal to the emperor. In a way, it seems like he presented his case about Paul fairly. At the same time, he doesn't really lay any fault at his own feet, which there certainly was some. Any questions on or comments on 10? Yes?
I had heard or read somewhere in the past that the Romans hated being in Israel just because of reasons like this, because they hated dealing with the Jews and the law that Jews would argue about incessantly, constantly. Had you heard or read it?
There was a mutual hatred between the Romans and the Jews. And why is it so important that the Romans be in Judea? Why is it so important?
Keep them from rebelling.
Yeah, but more than that, John?
It's a crossroads.
Right.
Africa and Asia.
Strategy. It's everything funnels through there. If you control that little neck, then you control what goes on everywhere else, and especially Egypt and Africa. Somebody else had their hand up, Mike.
But just that he's not terribly wrong in that in how many years down the road they are going to rebel again, and there's going to be wars. He's trying to keep them calm.
Right.
Because he knows there's powder there.
Right. Yeah, this is the fuse has already been lit, and you're not going to be able to stop it. So is his statement in verse 20 true? When you were, I'm over in Romans again. How did I get there? Verse 20. I was at a loss to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. And what does he leave out of that? What do we read earlier in the book about him asking Paul if he wanted to go? Trying to do the Jews a favor. He doesn't quite mention that. And the reason he asked may well have been uncertainty, but again, why go to Jerusalem to ascertain truth that could be brought before him right here, right now, in Caesarea where they are? So again, not a totally true statement. So question 12, what is Agrippa's reaction? Yeah, it seems like Agrippa is intrigued by Festus' description of the case. The literal Greek here is, I have been also myself wanting to hear the man, which kind of seems to indicate that Agrippa's been aware of Paul all this time and wants to hear about him, like from the past for a long time. But I think he's using this verb tense, which is an imperfect verb tense, as a courtesy. Your story has been intriguing me from the time you started it, and from the beginning of your story, I've been wanting to hear about him too. So it's a little bit narrower idea. I don't doubt that Agrippa had heard about Paul. I mean, he's been up and down the coast there and in this area and around the world. I think he probably wanted to see him as much as Herod Antipas wanted to see Jesus when he was being tried, hoping to see a miracle from him during Jesus' trials. And listen, Festus seems to leap at the opportunity to try to get a handle on the whole thing and let Agrippa weigh in on this. And we'll see why in a moment. Any other comments on Agrippa's reaction? Yes?
I just kind of always felt that Agrippa was amazed that one person could stir up so many others, and that was why he wanted to hear what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, he's, the Jews in Jerusalem are just up in arms about him. So, that's a good point. Question 13 is a quick question. To this point, have any charges been presented and proven that are worthy of death? No. There's been charges leveled. Jews came with a fistful of them, but they haven't been able to prove any of them. And again, quoting all the way back to Lysias, he's done nothing worthy of imprisonment or death, which again, and one of the slides I'll have up here later as Paul is before Agrippa, and you're going to remember, I wish you were just like me except for these chains. I'm not sure he really has chains on. I think he's using chains metaphorically, but the picture will have chains on it, so just be aware of that. So question 14, which is one we've kind of discussed already, what is the quandary that keeps Festus from letting Paul go? And the definition of quandary is a jam, a predicament, a dilemma. What's his issue? Go ahead, John.
Well, the issue is the appeal to Caesar. But the thing that kind of confuses me was, yes, Festus could have immediately dismissed him. Even when he appealed, he could have turned him loose. But in verse 21 is what confuses me when he says, but when Paul appealed to be held in custody, the way mine reads, for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I sent him to Caesar.
Right.
So is the Roman appeal system automatically keep him in custody? Or?
Yeah, and let me see here. I think I read that a moment ago. The word in custody has the idea of being held in ward. And so he's still in protective custody.
And like house arrest?
Yeah, well, not even house arrest. It's like when somebody takes a person and puts them in jail to protect them. It's not they haven't committed a crime. They're protecting them from having a crime committed on them. And that's the case with Paul. And I think a few weeks ago we mentioned that the Roman law allowed that, but it was only 2 years. You can only be kept in protective custody for 2 years. And 2 years have passed. Felix had him for 2 years. And so when Festus comes, Festus should have said, well, your time of protective custody is over, unless he renewed it, I suppose, because he knows that the Jews are wanting to kill him still. But yes, effectively, when Paul appealed to Caesar, it was taken out of Festus's hands. He couldn't release him now. Paul has demanded as a Roman citizen to be kept in ward until he can appeal to Caesar himself. And In fact, Paul could have left. He didn't have to talk to Festus anymore. There's no reason to talk to Festus. Festus can't do anything. Agrippa can't do anything. Nobody can do anything. He's going to Caesar, and that's where it's going to be. So, in essence, Festus' chance to release Paul ended when Paul appealed to Caesar. It was taken out of his hands. But there's more of a predicament than just that. That's the main predicament. And we'll see that in the next question. Question 15, why do you think Festus welcomed Agrippa's desire to hear him? Pardon me?
Took it out of his hand.
No, because it's still, it's not, who's higher, Caesar or Agrippa? Caesar. So, he's still in a predicament. And his predicament, and I'll give it to you now, we're a little early, but look at verse 26. He tells Agrippa, but I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore I have brought him before you, before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of the investigation, I may have something to write. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about it, but if somebody appeals to Caesar, they're appealing to Caesar because they have been charged, and he wants to take that case to the highest court. The problem here is, what Roman charges has he received? None. How's Caesar going to look at, I'll talk about that. I've got that's coming up in just a couple of questions. So question 16, does Paul's appearance before Agrippa fulfill any prophecy? Okay, Randy, yes. Do you know where?
Chapter 9.
Okay, chapter 9 and verse 15, Jesus said he's going to be my chosen vessel before the Gentiles and their kings. Okay? And then Acts 23 and verse 11, where Jesus appeared to Paul while he was under custody. Take courage, as you have testified before me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify to me in Rome. And so he's going to be before kings. He's going to all the way up to the Caesar. And both of those, by the way, were Jesus prophecies. And then question 17, I gave you the answer. Somebody asked me last week, I think. I don't know if you were doing your lesson while we were in class, and you said, by the way, what Caesar is he going to be in front of? And I gave you the answer. Now I see it's a question 17. Which Caesar is it? Nero. It's going to be Nero. Nero reigned from 54 AD to 68 AD when he basically committed suicide, burned the palace down around himself. All right. Any comments so far? Question 18, when was the hearing with Agrippa held? The very next day. Why so soon, do you suppose? That's an extra question.
He was in town.
Okay, and that's true. He's in town, but Agrippa's not in town just for a little while. If you look at verse 14, it said, since they were spending many days there. So they were coming for a while. And this seems to be right off the bat that he's dealing with this. But I think that you have to appreciate the urgency that Festus is feeling. I've got to find an answer. I've got to have something to write to the emperor about what's going on here. And all of that in the face that he knows what about Paul? He's done nothing wrong. I got to find something to write. Otherwise, he's going to look like an inept governor. That's the whole reason he's there. Here's what I was starting to mention a moment ago. So he's faced with writing the following to Nero. This man, a Roman citizen by birth, after more than one trial, was determined to have done nothing worthy of death or even imprisonment. But because both my predecessor and I were unwilling to declare the truth after 2 years, we're sending him to you without cause or reason. That's what he can write. We want you, Caesar, to make right what we were unwilling to do. I'm sure you understand. I would just love to be Nero getting that letter. And basically it boils down to Festus not thinking about whose wrath would you rather face, the wrath of the Jews or the wrath of Nero. And I think he would be better off with the Jews. Any comments on that? Question 19, which of Festus' opening remarks were true? Because his account here is truth and error. John?
Well, he says the whole Jewish community has petitioned me about it. That was true.
That's true. And they did that when they visited him in Jerusalem, and they did it again when they came to Caesarea. So, and it was true of Felix as well. What else? Okay, it was true Festus had found nothing guilty of anything worthy of death. It was true that Paul appealed to Caesar. And it was true that it's unreasonable to send a prisoner to the emperor without specifying a charge against him, which is the whole rub that Festus is going through. What statements were false?
The Jews were crying that he ought not live any longer?
No, I think that was their statements, and he doesn't mention that. I think what's unsaid is that if he declared Paul innocent, and released him, there wouldn't have been an appeal. But it was not true that he had nothing to write to the emperor. He actually did have something to write. He could write down the charges that the Jews brought against him. But Festus lacked any substantial evidence for any crimes that were committed against the state, and also he lacked any charges against Paul, or lacked courage to state that he was innocent. All right, so we're on chapter 26, and I didn't print off my notes, so I'm going to the office real quick to print off my notes.
You know where they are? I grabbed them.
Yeah, they're under my computer, my documents, Acts 20, 23, chapter 20, under the teacher file, the notes for chapter 26. All right, so Agrippa's standing there. You can go to is the PowerPoint working at all? Go on through. There we go. So you can see the chains there. So here's the chamber in which they are meeting. You have, in this picture, you have, I think, Agrippa in the middle with the red on. Bernice is there next to him on his left. And that's probably Festus pictured on his right. I don't know who all those other people are. I don't know that the Jews are still here. They very possibly could be. And that could be them. And so what happens? What's the first question in your lesson?
So what happened immediately after the festival?
Okay, so what immediately happens now as we open up chapter 26?
Paul's making his defense.
Okay, first Agrippa says something, right? So Agrippa gives him permission to speak. I mean, just boom, right out of the chute there, and to speak for yourself. And so, what does Paul do? Okay, he motions with his hands and began his defense. He demands his apologia to give the reason for why he's here. And there's many times that we read of Paul raising his hand, motioning with his hand to get everybody quiet or whatever, that he's about to speak. He did that when he was on the steps, when he was addressing the mob, is the last time that I clearly remember him. And isn't the second question, why was he pleased to be speaking to Agrippa?
Because he thought he was an expert in the customs of the Jews.
Okay. All right. So I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews, and especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. There I beg you to listen to me carefully. So as we talked about at the very beginning of the class, Agrippa was recognized as an expert in the law. And remember, we've talked about how weird it is that Drusilla and Bernice, their husbands, they want to make sure that they're circumcised before they marry them, even though they're Gentiles. And so there is this ingrained Jewishness in this Idumean family that the Herods were. And apparently, Agrippa knew the law. He knew the prophets. Paul's going to ask him later on in this speech if he knows the prophets. He knows the controversies that surround the Jews. I'm sure that he knows about the controversy between the Sadducees and the Pharisees about the resurrection and no resurrection. And so Paul is happy to actually be able to speak to someone who's intelligent and knowledgeable about the law and Jewish traditions and customs. All right, I'm waiting now. I'm tired of going from memory.
We haven't done our quiz.
Pardon me?
Never mind.
Dan, did you hear what Mona said?
No.
The reviewing the chapter?
Oh, that's a good idea. Oh, we haven't done that either, have we? We always do that at the beginning of a chapter. So chapter 1. You're right, choosing who? Matthias. Chapter 2. Pentecost. Chapter 3. Okay, and Peter's second sermon, chapter 4. First arrest. Barnabas is introduced, chapter 5. Ananias and Sapphira, chapter 6. Choosing of the 7, chapter 7. Stephen's defense, chapter 8. Samaria. Philip, Ethiopian eunuch, chapter 9. Conversion of Saul, chapter 10. Conversion of Cornelius, chapter 11. Peter's defense for going into Cornelius, chapter 12. Okay, James is killed, Herod dies, Peter's escaped, chapter 13. First missionary journey begins, chapter 14. Yes, Paula Stone, and first missionary journey ends, chapter 15.
Second mission begins.
Jerusalem conference, chapter 16. By the way, chapter 15, also the second journey begins. Yeah. Chapter 16. Okay, and where does that all take place? In Philippi. Chapter 17. Athens, chapter 18. Corinth, chapter 19. Ephesus, chapter 20. Paul at Troas. And by the way, chapter 18 in Corinth, the second journey ends. Also, we have the third journey beginning. Chapter 21 or chapter 20 is Troas, and Paul meets with who? Ephesian elders at Troas. Chapter 21. Third journey ends, and Paul is arrested. 22. Paul's defense to who? The people, the mob. Chapter 23. The plot to kill Paul, and he's sent where? He's sent to Felix. He's sent to Felix. Chapter 24. His defense before Felix, chapter 25. We just finished it. Yeah, Paul before Festus, and Festus introducing the case against Paul to Agrippa, and now chapter 26, Paul before Agrippa. Okay. Boy, I could have handwritten those notes this fast.
You probably lost them for you.
Yeah, I don't know where they went. Well, talk among yourselves. I know where they are. Because my notes didn't save, so I get to do them all over again. But we've got 2 minutes left, and I'm not going to take us any further. I'm going to release you early. Please don't run up and down the halls and disturb the kids' classes. So sorry about that, but we'll start with Acts 26, and I'll pretend like we didn't even start next week.